So, Mega Man X8. Released in 2004 on PlayStation 2, and the last game in the Mega Man X sub-series of games. Well, the last numbered game, that is. There's still that command mission thing that's more of an RPG thing, a side type thing, or whatever. But after the interesting experiment that was Mega Man X7... Was it worth it, X? Was it worth it to sacrifice your life for Chuck? What did Chuck give you for your efforts? Nothing. That's what he gave you. Nothing. Fuck this game. X8 brings the series back to what made it good. 2D side-scrolling platforming action, but not wanting to dump the 3D graphics entirely, X8 adopts a 2.5D visual style where everything is built in 3D but plays 2D or something, and sometimes there's some awkward camera perspectives intended to make it dynamic but really detract from the gameplay. In any event, it's a return to the formula that worked best. Side-scrolling platforming action, for the most part, intro level, 8 Mavericks, and a final stretch of final levels before the conclusion. So I'm gonna be honest with you folks here, I have not touched Mega Man X8 in well over a decade. Possibly longer than that. I've probably played a bit of it every once in a while on the Legacy Collection thing, but this is the first time in a good long while that I really gave it the time of day. And for the most part, we'll be sticking with the vintage PS2 version, though the Legacy Collection version is probably more ideal these days if you want to sample the game, but that's just me. So how is Mega Man X8 after all these years? It's okay. It's not perfect, it's not great, it's merely okay. That's it. And so it begins. We begin with the intro level, where you're given an opportunity to sample all 3 playable characters at different points. Let's touch on these quickly. X is the traditional Mega Man X style. Charge shot, dashing, eventually gains new weapons via boss kills, and can collect pieces for 2 new sets of armor via light capsules found throughout the game, with a new ability to mix and match pieces of armor, which is kind of neat, though you gain additional perks for using all the same armor parts. Zero is the usual close quarters fighter with a nifty double jump ability, and eventually learns new attacks as well as build new melee weapons. As for Axel, he still has his copy shot, and believe it or not, it actually feels somewhat useful at times, particularly if you're hunting for secrets, and it also helps that it doesn't take as many hits to kill an enemy for their 8-trans data, but now he has a rapid-fire shot that can be aimed in all 8 directions, he retains his hovering ability from the previous game, and he has his own set of weapons gained from bosses that use no weapon energy and can also be shot in 8 directions. So there is a bit of incentive to experiment with these different characters and see who serves best in each situation. Making its return from X7 is the team-up mechanic, where you choose 2 characters to tackle stages and can swap between the 2 at any time. There's a couple changes here. Most notable is that if one of your heroes gets killed, you switch over to the other hero, though falling into pits or instant death traps will still end your game regardless. Also, as you take damage, you'll note these red slabs in your health meter. Tag out, and that red slab will slowly regenerate health, somewhat similar to the Marvel vs. Capcom series of games. Finally, you'll note this additional meter that fills up at times. When it's full, press L2 while close to an enemy, and you'll trigger this team-up attack that takes place in a Matrix-esque setting where your heroes unleash bloody havoc and strikes everything on screen, an especially devastating attack towards bosses if you time it right. In any event, this introductory level teaches you all these things, and first impression? Hey, this isn't too bad. Relatively straightforward, the mechanics are pretty solid. It feels somewhat like a standard Mega Man X platformer, save for the odd camera perspective here and there, and the physics feel kinda wonky at first, but yeah, not bad. It's the first time in a long while where an intro level gives you a sampler of things to come, and so far so good. I've got a good feeling about this Mega Man X8 game. And then you get to the main meat of the game, the traditional stage select with 8 Mavericks for you to tackle, and at least 2 of them being almost entirely ride chaser levels, save for the eventual boss battle. Neither of them is particularly good, but the city one where you're chasing this Man of War thing? Fuck off with that noise. No, fuck right the fuck off with that noise. This is shit. The remaining 6 Maverick levels and the subsequent Sigma levels, because it's not that big of a surprise actually, are your traditional side-scrolling platforming fare, and each level is built around a theme and or gimmick that you'll have to endure throughout, whether it be gravity manipulating buttons, running from or chasing a rampaging mechanoid, or riding a ride armor thing against other ride armor things, among other things. Some gimmicks are good, others are not so good, but all follow a somewhat basic level structure that we'll touch on later. One positive is that they got rid of the Reploids in distress, which is one less concern on your journeys. X8 also overhauls the parts system to something that makes a little more sense. It's basically a shop where you could purchase parts using these metal triangles that are dropped by enemies and scattered throughout the game. In addition to these common metals used as currency to purchase these things, there are also rare metals hidden throughout the levels that adds more parts to the shop that you could purchase, which I'm not really a big fan of, getting the part and then having to buy it again at the shop, but whatever. Rare metals and armor capsules for X are the only things hidden within the level that you have to seek out, as the hard containers of games past have been excised in its favor of life extensions you could purchase from the shop, while sub-tanks have been reincarnated into rare metals which... Finally, you have a choice of 3 navigators to guide you on your way. Alia for general strategies, Lair for boss tactics, and Palette for secrets and alternate routes. If you prefer, you could go through the levels without a navigator, which took them a while to finally give us that option, but there you go, better late than never, I suppose. Instead of a normal live system where you lose a life and respawn at a checkpoint, and if you lose all your lives it's game over, start the level all over again, a system that has worked for Mega Man since the very first game, Mega Man X instead gives you Retry Chips, which is similar, except now every time you die, a menu will pop up asking you if you want to continue from the last checkpoint or go back to the stage select. You have 2 retry chips that always regenerate, and up to 3 more can be purchased if desired, but only if played on normal. Easy gives you unlimited retries, while hard forces you to buy more chips when you run out, and you could only carry up to 3. Retry chips tend to be a huge source of contention among fans for some reason, and my view is that if you're good at the game and you don't die often, it's a non-issue. But until then, my only gripe with retry chips is the prompt that pops up after each death, which feels like a waste of time. And I'll admit that past X games have made lives and game overs meaningless because... You know what, I'll let this clip from last year's X5 review explain it. Hell, they even made lives pointless, as continuing after a game over instead of restarting you at the beginning of the level lets you resume from the last checkpoint as if you merely lost another life, removing the whole point of lives and game overs which mattered in past Mega Man until now. But there is an easier fix to this problem, which is basically make the player start the level over from scratch after a game over. You know, like they used to do with the old games when they kept it simple, stupid. The only other game to feature retry chips, to my recollection at least, was the first Mega Man Zero game, and then that would get dropped in favor of regular lives for the rest of the series, so that was a fad that died quickly, and I don't know if I should spend more time on retry chips just to piss off some folks who are tired of people complaining about retry chips. Did I hit that quota yet? About 3 paragraphs, close to 400 words, some ad-libs? Oh well, really doesn't matter, does it? The biggest compliment I could levy towards Mega Man X8 is that it is not Mega Man X7. Mind you, it's not much of a compliment to be better than an otherwise terrible entry in the series, but veering away from that travesty... Okay, somewhat. The ride-chasing level where you're chasing the jellyfish boss in the city is the absolute drizzling shits. Probably one of the most irritating levels ever conceived, with the only positive being that once you beat it, you'd never have to go back to it, so thank fuck for that. The other ride chaser level where you're riding down a track with slopes and pits in the ice level and stuff is the least offensive of the 2 ride chaser levels, but not much better either. Then again, I was never a fan of these ride chaser levels, even when they were done well, whatever that actually entails, but I digress. But the game itself is fine, I guess. If nothing else, there are some positive aspects that I like about X8. I like the fact that you have 3 distinct characters that play differently from each other, right down to the weapons and techniques earned from killing Maverick bosses. And the weapons themselves are a varied lot that are fun to use, or at the very least serve some sort of function. Either way, it does vary up the gameplay a bit. The little intermission bits where you play a timed bonus round to earn more medals is a nice little diversion, and a practice round of sorts. I like that you'll occasionally run into Vile during levels, which gives it some sort of interactivity, I guess. The ability to intermix armored pieces is pretty neat. The boss fights are actually pretty fun, and each one has a desperation attack that they'll execute near death, which heats things up a bit. They also tend to not drag as much as they did in X7, which... no reploids to save, no random bullshit to determine your fate, a refined team mechanic that's actually useful and fun to use, and a proper shop system to purchase items from, even if you have to seek out the rare metals to open up more items to buy, which seems more like busy work than anything, but hey, it's better than what they had before, but not as good as what you had on Game Boy Color, but that's another story entirely. And there's little odds and ends that you can unlock through repeated plays or more likely codes, extra characters, armors, and such, stuff you normally wouldn't be able to get, and those are fun to play with, I think. One thing I will say about Control is that it's pretty smooth, fairly functional and responsive, almost about as good as a traditional 2D Mega Man. The physics might not be as smooth, but it's manageable and a minor gripe. That said, I do feel Capcom might have missed a trick here, and maybe because Metroid Dread as I'm recording this is a thing, and the thought occurred while playing this, but you control your character with either the D-pad or the left analog stick, and Axel can shoot in 8 directions with either input. Anyway, the thought occurred that if you could have aimed with the stick and pulled off more precise aiming, more than 8 directions, would have been something unique for this iteration, and something you really couldn't pull off in previous sprite-based generations of Mega Man X. It's just a random thought I had, and Control is otherwise just fine, so whatever. So there's little bits and pieces to X8 that I think are done well, and then there's the other stuff that keeps it from achieving that top tier level. One of those being level design being somewhat too gimmick driven. Let's do a chase scene. Let's do a thing with mini games. Let's do an auto-scroller. I'd be down with it if the level design was inspired, but it usually isn't. It's usually fairly basic, go from point A to point B, stop the challenge a mini gauntlet before moving on, try to navigate the meticulously placed spike beds and pits. That's usually X8's crutch in trying to amp up difficulty. Lots of spike beds and in places that are somewhat difficult to maneuver around. Usually also a sign of lazy level design. This platforming segment's too easy, just add more spikes, yo. Done. Every so often you'll enter a room where all forward momentum comes to a halt and you have to endure a little gauntlet session before moving onwards. This could include killing a bunch of enemies or avoiding a bunch of obstacles. It's a trope that I've seen in a number of games that I've played, and it's also one I really don't care for. The sort of thing you apply when you can't think of anything better to challenge the player with clever design or, I don't know, maybe a mid-boss fight or something. So instead you do this thing where the player has to endure whatever before moving on. This is fine when you're playing like a beat 'em up or something like that, but on an action platformer like Mega Man X, it just kills the pacing and momentum. Sometimes, instead of a mini gauntlet, you'll challenge Vile, and I don't mind the Vile fights because it's a mid-boss fight and not something where I have to avoid things for a couple of seconds or whatever, I don't know. And yeah. Even the armors you eventually assemble for X are somewhat underwhelming. While it's cool that you get to mix and match armor pieces, and equipping completed armors will enable special perks, like the screen-nuking Icarus Giga Crush or the performance-enhancing Hermes X Drive, the benefits gained from the individual parts seem somewhat bland. A slightly higher jump, an invisible dash, a super lasers that leaves you completely immobile. I mean, that's it. That's the best we could... You know, I guess after 7 games you're bound to run short on unique armor takes and upgrades, and it's sad that the best armor X can use in this game is the hidden ultimate armor, and even that feels somewhat gimped compared to previous entries. But hey, you get a Shoryuken now with it, so that's something, I guess? Oh well. At least they made the A-Trance useful compared to the previous game, and I have Zero's spinning thing, which is useful for reaching high places and... What the... Yeah, whatever, just go with it. Mega Man X8 adopts a 2.5D perspective for all its in-game bits, which means everything is a polygon and has different zooms and camera perspectives depending on the situation. I'm going to put it out there, I hate the parts where the camera is zooming or turning or whatever the case may be that isn't giving me whatever visibility I need to see exactly what the fuck is going on. I get that it makes the scene more dynamic or whatever, and back in the day you're trying to do anything to make this simple classic style of gameplay more exciting than it actually is, especially in light of other games available at the time, but I prefer something more functional, especially in what is theoretically supposed to be a side-scrolling action game. That's more of a personal gripe than anything, except for that one writer level with the jellyfish, all the sudden turns and jerks and whatever. No, seriously, that level can go fuck itself. Anyway, for what it's worth, it runs fairly smoothly with few bits of slowdown here and there. The character models and the way they move look fine, as do the various environments you'll be traveling in. By PlayStation 2 standards, it's a perfectly fine looking video game, and if nothing else, I do enjoy the variety of environments you get to tackle in, compared to X7's more sterile, monotonous looking terrains, so that's something. The few cutscenes in the game that aren't just talking heads of static text have this cel-shaded look to it that actually looks pretty good. The faces are a bit stiff at times, but yeah, I like this style of presentation. Much more livelier than X7 or X9, which came out years later and... Oh wait, what's that? That isn't... Oh fuck, how did I make that mistake? I'm sorry. Sound-wise, nothing to complain about, really. Your usual collection of sound effects and vocal grunts, some of which are recycled from previous games, as is usually the case with these games. The soundtrack's a bit of a mixed bag. It's better than X7 in terms of musical variety, and some of the tracks are much more livelier compared to its predecessor, but there isn't anything that really stands out, and after a while, they all start to sound the same and become forgettable. The elevator music ain't too bad in this one though, I'll give it that much. Unfortunately, the elevator ride itself is a pile of shit, but that's besides the point. And of course there is voice acting, because of course there is. And it's pretty good. Probably the best voice acting in these older Mega Man games due to some solid vocal performances and generally better dialogue, which helps in elevating the relatively mediocre storytelling that X8 suffers from. Not much else to add there. Actually, you know what? I'm sorry, I take it back. The story is ridiculous and not in a good way. All this nonsensical rhetoric about new worlds and robots copying other robots, and by the way, we're trying to migrate the world population to the moon, and the best solution is to build a really tall elevator? Seriously? Didn't we have like a fucking space colony in space just 3 games ago? Did you really need an elevator for that? What, we don't have spaceships or anything like that in the year 21XX that we can't transport these fuckers to the moon? Okay, yeah, so the story's absolute rubbish, but at least the voice acting's more than adequate, so what do I care? Overall, Mega Man X8 is better than Mega Man X7. It's the bare minimum I was expecting out of this game, and I certainly got that much at least. And I'll admit that my initial impressions in revisiting X8 for the first time in years wasn't entirely positive. The gimmicky levels, the mini gauntlet things, the annoying prompts after each death, the less than stellar armors, and that fucking city jellyfish level, among other minor quibbles, dampened my enthusiasm and enjoyment somewhat. Suffice it to say that it took a while for me to warm up to X8, and eventually it did start to grow on me. The different characters and their different weapons, the stage gimmicks that aren't total garbage, the fun boss fights, and the multiple difficulty settings, with the hard difficulty adding a couple curveballs to the mix. You know what, I said at the beginning that X8 was okay, but after a while I could safely say that this was a little more than okay. Better than average. Not great, not fantastic, not one of the best ever, and certainly not one I would recommend to first-timers at least, but an otherwise perfectly acceptable little Mega Man game that has its moments and could have been an interesting direction to follow gameplay-wise had the series continued along that route. But alas, as of this recording at least, Mega Man X8 is the last main numbered entry in the series. There will be another X title in Maverick Hunter X for the PSP, but other than the token re-release and a couple mobile games here and there, not so much as a peep. Time will tell if there's a Mega Man X9 to look forward to in the future or some other derivative of that franchise. Mega Man's 35th anniversary is this year, so time will tell if Capcom even remembers that and does something special to mark the occasion. But more than likely, they're just going to release some more Street Fighter rubbish instead. But in the meantime, Mega Man X8 is fine. And that's all I got. And that does it for that, I guess. So I guess it's time to move on to something else. And thank fuck for that. Because I'm all mega'd out.